The topic of North Korea, the impact of sanctions versus economic development, seems a little remote from what we see in the news. We see nuclear annihilation and a very escalated crisis, yet an ongoing crisis that appears to be in eternal stalemate. So it was with that in mind that I met with my dear friend, Katharina Zellweger. When she is at Stanford as a visiting fellow, we meet. And back in May, we thought that this would be the time to have a program about North Korea. And it is because of her connections that we're able to pull this together.
Okay, our presenter. I had the great opportunity to talk to Katharina Zellweger out in the hallway a little while ago, and folks, she and James Person, who is, he was up here a second ago, is going to be our speakers today, and these people have dedicated their lives to this topic. So you're not coming here to hear people talk about this superficially. These people have the experience. We used to call them dirty hands experts. They would actually get in there. They have the actual experience of being there, talking to the people, seeing the stuff that's going on, and then coming back and telling you exactly what is going on. And it's not being filtered through a bunch of political biases. So I'm going to start off talking about Katharina, and tell you a little bit about her so you can become familiar with her. She has had a career in international aid as a manager for over 30 years in the field of North Korea, Hong Kong, and China. She lived and worked in Pyongyang, North Korea for 5 years from 2006 to 2011 as a North Korea country director for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, called the SDC. She focused on sustainable agricultural production to address food security issues, income generation, and capacity development to contribute to individual and institutional learning. And prior to joining the SDC, she spent almost 30 years working for the Catholic service agency Caritas, which is all over the world. They have 170 chapters. And the one here in California that we're familiar with is Catholic Charities? Catholic Relief Services, which many of you may know about. She's a Pantech Fellow in Korean Studies at Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford University. And in December of 2005, she received the Justice and Peace Award from a South Korean foundation established to promote the vision of social justice. And in 2006, as part of her recognition for her path-breaking work in North Korea, she was made a Dame of the St. Gregory the Great organization and awarded this distinction by the Vatican.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to celebrate with you the 72nd United Nations Day. The last time I was at a similar function was actually in Pyongyang in 2010. So from that you realize that I will be talking about North Korea, a topic which is very much in the news these days. North Korea is still a poor country. Continued food insecurity, however, no longer famine, but chronic malnutrition, in addition to energy shortages and dilapidated infrastructure are among the main hindering factors preventing the country and its people to move forward. The 2017 Needs and Priority Plan, developed by 5 UN agencies, 7 international NGOs, and 1 bilateral organization, all operating in North Korea with staff members on the ground, calls for $114 million to meet the basic needs of 13 million vulnerable people. divide that figure and you come to $8.7 per person. External assistance plays an important role in safeguarding the lives of millions of people. Expectations on aid agencies are high, and so is the challenge, with a severe lack of funding. An example, for a similar program in 2016, only 26% of the money truly needed for this initiative was collected. In other words, $44 million were received to assist 13 million people, vulnerable North Koreans. And again, that means $3.38 per person per year, not even a cup of coffee these days. So you might be asking the question, is aid making a difference? Humanitarian aid programs were launched for the first time in the DPRK's history as a result of the famine in 1995. It was a huge learning process for all involved. Aid agencies knew very little about North Korea, and the North Koreans very little about international humanitarian aid and its planning and delivery system. Monitoring aid brought me in touch with families, with doctors, hospital patients, farmers, teachers, and children. In the beginning, people were very reluctant to meet strangers. Even eye contact was avoided. But by now, people are less fearful when dealing with foreigners, have become more curious about our way of life, and some even dream of traveling abroad. Living standards of ordinary people have improved because of aid programs. A water tap in a family home makes a huge difference. Or increased family income because of an agricultural support program. These interactions are transforming relationships. Opinions of foreigners are changing. Information from abroad is impacting views and attitudes. During the famine years, aid saved lives, many lives. As said, overall, living conditions have modestly improved. This is not so much due to aid interventions. Of course, they do play a role, but it is because of the strong will and the resourcefulness of the local people, and also a certain empowerment to make decisions, be it in terms of participating in market activities or entrepreneurship, and experimenting with authorized change in the farming policy, to just name a few of crucial recent developments. Right now, I visit North Korea 2-3 times a year because I have established my own NGO in Hong Kong, mainly to help people with disabilities in the DPRK. So I'd like to give you a few impressions of my most recent visits. One was in March and one was in September. What struck me when I got there was that new propaganda posters have appeared everywhere, in the capital, in smaller towns, and in the countryside. In fact, everybody with an interest in the DPRK is familiar with the country's propaganda. The North Koreans themselves are inundated with propaganda in schools, at the workplace, on TV, or in the newspapers. The purpose and themes of the propaganda have not changed much in the past 50 years, but the people on the receiving end have. While for an outsider, North Korean propaganda may be anything from chilling to amusing, for North Korean citizens, it's just there. However, at present, the regime is using the tensions with the US, and this is reflected in these aggressive posters with the aim to boost new hatred for America. And also, what made me feel somewhat uncomfortable on my last visit in September was the fact that increasingly ordinary North Koreans were talking about war. I was, for example, asked if people outside were also discussing war on the Korean Peninsula. And a lot of self-confident statements such as, "Let's get it done, we will win the war," enough of this belt-tightening were made. It was strange. But on a more positive note, my impression is that today, many of the younger generation of North Koreans are different. Why? They grew up at a time when the government no longer was providing regular handouts. They are no longer dependent on rations and subsidized food and goods from the state. Their expectations on their government are different from a generation before. Marketization has become common across the whole society. They are aware that they must fend for themselves. And that means they are now eager to learn new tools to improve their lives and act independently, of course, within a frame of reference the government has set for them. Shops in Pyongyang were also well stocked, and there are more locally processed food on the shelves. And in the back alleys, there were many fruit and vegetable vendors. Food production has advanced. Also at present, there are no figures about this year's harvest. When I went to North Korea for the first time in 1995, there were no markets. The government was providing more or less everything. So that's a big change. And then nowadays, farms and factories have more freedom in terms of production. Quotas can be negotiated, and this leaves room for excess production, and that is a strong encouragement for managers and workers. These new developments have, however, not lessened the control on individual citizens. I also saw more cars, jeeps, and motorbikes on the road, and by now, for example, in Pyongyang, we have 5 taxi companies operating and competing with each other, and even small taxi services in smaller towns. Sometimes cars driven by the batteries or minibuses are used. Of course, in the countryside, it's very often the bicycle. The bicycle plays an important role not only in getting from A to B, but also in terms of transporting heavy rice and corn sacks. So there are changes. I also, of course, met with my expatriate colleagues there, and one of them wondered and expressed concern whether the international community would be allowed to leave if there was some type of US intervention, or if they, like the staff of the Malaysian embassy, would be taken hostage. I spoke to the UN resident coordinator, and he assured me that he is discussing this issue or this scenario regularly with the host government. The DPRK is required to provide information and help with possible evacuation, and in case that is not possible, or until that is possible, provide safe shelter to internationals residing in Pyongyang. It is not a big community, by the way. I think if we are 300 to 400 people, that's it, basically. And now to our theme, the sanctions. The aim of the various sanctions, and we have UN sanctions, US sanctions, EU sanctions, Japanese sanctions, South Korea sanctions. North Korea is one of the heaviest sanctioned countries in the whole world. So because of the sanctions, or the aim of the various sanctions is to put pressure on the Kim Jong-un regime to change its behavior by squeezing North Korea economically. UN and unilateral sanctions imposed on the DPRK do exclude humanitarian assistance and should not influence aid projects, at least in theory. I noted during my last visit that gradually the sanctions are having an impact, but rather than hurting the regime, the sanctions are instead impacting ordinary North Korean people. If fuel prices go up, the elite will still be driven around, but bus services for common citizens will become too expensive. Fees and charges are being imposed for all sorts of services, and this again hurts ordinary people the most. It is a downward chain to the poor. So the longer the sanctions exist, the more hardship we will see among ordinary people. The most vulnerable, people with disability, the sick, the elderly, women and children already feel it. The level of humanitarian assistance is decreasing year by year, not only because funding problems, but because of current, more complicated and lengthy procurement processes and slow delivery, to which I will go into later on again. Chinese business people are much less active, and some have recently left the country. The new sanctions cover nearly all North Korean trade and also all banks. Commercial activities have slowed down. Joint ventures are required to stop operating, and no new ones are to be established. Moreover, factories in North Korea are starting to have difficulties in purchasing raw materials or spare parts, with the result that there is or will be under or unemployment. More people will have difficulties to make ends meet. More people will fall through an already weak social safety net. North Korean business people working abroad are returning. This because their work permits are no longer renewed and business opportunities shrinking. often back home without a job to go back to. They are now being absorbed within organizations of the government. And more young people are apparently joining the army, not only because of the loyalty to their own country, but because attractive career prospects, such as working for a joint venture, a trading company, an embassy, or an international organization, are all decreasing. And how do we aid agencies feel the sanctions? I give you a few examples. It starts that donors are reluctant to provide funds for projects in North Korea. Banking channels no longer exist, and it's almost impossible to transfer funds for daily operational costs or pay Chinese suppliers. This, despite the dispensation for humanitarian aid activities. I was supposed to settle a bill for my own NGO. The money has been returned 3 times with no reasons given why, and of an amount of $8,000, we now have lost $1,000 for exchange rate differences. And cash operations are undesirable and risky. And then delays in procurement are common due to additional requirements for licensing and the need to ensure that the equipment or the supplies are not on any sanction list. Or North Korean companies that used to operate according to international standards have been pushed into the gray zone. We are teaching them how to go past the sanctions or find ways. And then it is increasingly becoming difficult to find international companies willing to accept orders for North Korea, even if the items to be purchased are clearly for humanitarian purposes. And one more point, support for aid projects from Korean Americans is shrinking. The travel ban imposed by the US government prohibits visits to North Korea. For Korean compatriots from abroad, this is the term the North Koreans use. Direct contacts with North Koreans was not only for checking the donations provided, but even more so for building personal relationships. It is not a good picture right now. Still, a question I am asked very often, has the DPRK changed in the past 20 years? I would say yes and no, but it is certainly no longer the same country I experienced in 1995. And some years ago, I created the term, the 5 M's. And these M's are still valid. They include the fact that markets and money are playing a much bigger role in the daily lives of ordinary people. Mobile phones have become a common form of communication. Motor cars have increased. And lastly, in Pyongyang, there is a middle class developing. I would say today, another M can be added, and that is mindsets. Mindsets of especially the younger generation are changing. In closing, the flyer for this event points out 2 sustainable development goals to be achieved by 2030. Goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And goal number 17, partnerships for goals. I must admit, I am concerned that the progress and developments made in recent years will fade away. At the same time, I am convinced that pressure and sanctions will not solve the problem on the Korean Peninsula. In fact, sanctions frequently increase the resolve or determination of the country being targeted by sanctions, both at the government level and among ordinary people. Only engagement offers a chance to address issues in a constructive and peaceful way. I also sincerely hope that political considerations will not hinder the continued aid and support for the North Korean people, who, after all, are the victims of geopolitical factors well beyond their control. Thank you.
If engagement is the only way to work with North Korea, what does engagement look like to you? What kind of ways would we interact with North Korea, in your opinion?
It's a very good question, and engagement can basically mean a lot of things. It starts with the humanitarian aid programs. It can be scholarships. It can be exchanges. And I do think people-to-people contacts is the key to smoothing this tense situation. And this is not just between North Korea and the US, it's also between North and South Korea, because relations there are also very strained. So I think you can look at many different angles to find engagements, and hopefully that then moves the situation into the right direction. And as said earlier on, the sad story is also that North Korea has no constituency. All we have is the press, which is 99% of the time negative. You can get negative news very easily into the press, but you can hardly ever get anything a little bit positive about North Korea into today's media. So those are all issues which form opinions of how we view North Korea, and I think at times, or especially right now, it's pretty dangerous. If we only believe what we see or hear through our media, and we don't have any personal contacts. You know, I have had students at Stanford who said, "Oh, we hate the North Koreans." And I said, "Well, how many North Koreans have you met?" And they were all baffled because they had never met a North Korean person. And I think that's where engagement starts.